Right, hello and good evening, everybody. Today I'm speaking again to Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and the topic, as per the title, is the Israeli-Iran standoff. And I suppose you can add the US to the standoff as well. So, yeah, Dave, welcome to the channel.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Right, so would you give us maybe like a short update as to what is happening in the Middle East? Those of us who've been following the stuff for the last 6 months. I think some of us have lost interest, to be honest, in the thing, and then it pops up every now and then, like the Iranian attacks. But what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean that is the latest, I guess big news that's happened is this situation with Iran and Israel. So the latest with that, so on April 1st, Israel bombed Iran's consulate
Mm.
diplomatic facility in Damascus, Syria. They killed about 16 people, including 7 members of the IRGC and then a very senior Quds Force commander. And I think it's important for people to understand that this was a big escalation, but it also kind of wasn't anything new because Israel has a long history of targeting Iranians in Syria over the past few years, really.
Yeah.
And the big escalation here was that they bombed a diplomatic facility. This is a building that was attached to the Iranian embassy. I mean, if any other country did that, imagine what the response from the US would be. But they just totally downplayed it, and I mean, it's really unbelievable. A lot of things happened on that date, April 1st. That was the same day that Israel killed the World Central Kitchen workers for this global humanitarian group that was operating in Gaza. Now, Israel's been killing aid workers this whole time. Something like 200 aid workers have been killed, but this time they killed Westerners. There's an American, um, a few people from the UK, I think one from Poland and Australia. So that got a lot of attention, and that almost overshadowed Israel bombing the Iranian embassy because that was big news. And again, if you follow this stuff, over the past few years, and you could go back, a decade to Israeli assassinations of nuclear scientists inside Iran. Um, since October 7th, Israel really stepped up its airstrikes in Syria. And I believe by my count, between October 7th and the embassy bombing, they killed 7 Iranians, members of the IRGC, in that time. And then they killed another 7. And again, a very senior general at an embassy. So Iran usually doesn't respond. They're usually either very restrained in their responses to Israel or they don't respond at all. But this time, I mean, they had to do something because it was just such a brazen attack. I mean, it was the middle of the day when this place got bombed. It was so they had to respond and they waited a little while. And then we saw that big drone and missile attack on Israel. And they say they launched over 300 drones and missiles. So this was a big deal. This is the first time Iran's ever done anything like this to Israel. They also choreographed what they were going to do. Iran they actually said that they told the US about it, 72 hours in advance. The US denied that, but Iran said they told other countries in the region. And I know Jordan and officials from Turkey, I think Iraq, confirmed that they knew it was coming. So if they knew, then, it got back to the US. And most of the missiles and drones were intercepted. Some hit an Israeli airbase. But it was still, it was a very big attack. I mean, even though it was kind of carefully planned, it seemed like, that's a lot of missiles and drones to fire at a
Yeah.
country. So the big question was, is Israel going to respond? And then this past Friday, it was really Thursday night here in the U.S. that the news broke that there was some explosions in Iran. And at first, it seemed like it might have been a big attack because you had these U.S. officials immediately go to the media and say, "Oh, Israel launched a missile attack on Iran." And so, you kind of assume missiles. It sounds like it's big, but it turned out it was pretty small. Iran said that they downed 3 drones, like very small, like quadcopter drones. And this is another thing: Israel has launched attacks like this before inside Iran. With their whoever their assets are, their intelligence assets inside Iran.
I mean,
Um,
usually they use the Kurds, the Jewish Kurds, to try and instigate stuff over there, and also,
mhm,
I mean, when there was riots, I mean, it's something whether it's Israel, the US, it's questionable sometimes, but we know that when there is call it legitimate protest in Iran, sometimes these people have weapons, and it's always questionable where they get the weapons from. And then Iran also has, to sketch people who have a picture about Iran, it's a multicultural society where the Persians are just over 50% of the population. So there's always separatist movements that can easily be instigated, if you will, because there's always going to be resentment in any country of that level of minorities. And then just something else to point out, which I think to sketch here is, generally speaking, Khamenei, the supreme leader, has been quite restrained,
mhm,
okay, in his response, historically speaking, whether it's against the US or against the in Israel. And this is not because he's a pacifist. It is because within Iran, next to him, if you will, on the political spectrum, there's always guys that are itching for war, especially from the military and the intelligence. And the religious clerics, yeah, they're quite crazy with some of the rules they want to enforce, but they've been a restraint on the military power. So, the logic inside Iran would always be, why are you doing this? Why aren't we showing strength? There's always a certain section of the population that wants to retaliate because they feel like they're being attacked, right? And the religious people, for whatever critic you can label against them, has been restrained in the past. So I thought this was a little bit of a watershed moment that he let go of it, but it seems that they sort of planned it restraint. And then just the other thing to point out, where they attacked in Iran is at Isfahan, where my wife's from. Okay, so it's the same city. And it wasn't really in Isfahan. As far as we can tell, it is a radio station outside of Isfahan. So it didn't seem to me that Israel was in their retaliation also doing maximum damage. It didn't seem to me. It seemed to be a little bit of a, for lack of a better word, a dick waving exercise.
yeah. Yeah, that is what it seemed like. So, and then you see the Iranians are really downplaying it. Now, I saw there are these other reports, like the New York Times reported that an Israeli airstrike did actually hit Iran, a base in Isfahan, in the Isfahan province, I guess, not in the city, but and that there was some damage, but that hasn't been confirmed. And they're showing satellite images and stuff, but I guess that's just still not confirmed.
Yeah.
But we're seeing, Iran, they're not even saying it was Israel that did it. I don't think Israel's taking official credit. I mean, they're openly, like Israeli officials are openly talking about it. But yeah, so it seems like both sides right now are not interested in an escalation. I would say, especially, it's very clear because Khamenei just said yesterday that, the Iranian forces have had great success against Israel. And it sounded like he was like, going to leave it at that, basically. So that's where we're at now. The big wild card, the Iranians are much more predictable than the Israelis at this point. You never know what they're going to do, and there's always the possibility that they do more because they did also. It looked like they launched airstrikes in Syria the same night of that Iran attack, and there was reports of damage. They targeted the Syrian military, which unfortunately for them, nobody's going to be retaliating when they get bombed. They get bombed by Israel all the time. Nobody defends them. Um, but there's a chance, I think, you just never know right now. Like, it does seem like Netanyahu wants to provoke a big regional war that would get the US to directly intervene. So there's a possibility that this what happened this past Friday was not the end of it. They might have other things planned. Whether that's another attack directly on Iran or more stuff in like Syria. They could always escalate in Lebanon. I mean, that's just another really volatile area. They've been
So one thing that struck me before these attacks is that there were hints from Biden. Now these were subtle hints. I'm not giving him that much credit at trying to restrain Netanyahu a little bit.
mhm.
Saying don't do this, pointing sort of things. And we know every time this happens, the Israelis up the ante because they don't seem to care if they drag the US into another war in the Middle East. I mean, it's in their benefits and their geopolitical interest, according to some people over there. I mean, to what extent do you think that might also play some role in this?
Yeah, I mean, it did seem like that was the message that Biden sent, that the U.S. sent pretty much right after this Iranian attack. They're trying to portray it as a success that the air defenses worked, even though a lot of the stuff was intercepted by like the U.S. and the U.K. fighter jets that took off. But I mean, that was definitely the signal that the US was sending, but the question is, like, how much pressure they actually put on Israel. That's not really clear because while they're saying that they're not gonna participate in an offensive, basically, they were saying they wouldn't support an offensive attack against Iran, but they were also saying that they would continue to defend Israel, so basically saying that they'll have their back to deal with whatever consequences there are. Um, but yeah, it could have played a role in this, seeing a limited attack. That could have been a decision by Israel because they knew that they didn't want to push it too much with the Americans. Um, and another thing that this did, it really took the attention off Gaza. You know, it seems like, and I think that's another thing that Netanyahu wants is just less international attention on what Israel's doing in Gaza. I mean, we saw in Congress there was like kind of a growing opposition among Democrats to arming Israel with unconditional military aid, and then this attack on Iran and this Iranian attack on Israel, and then all of a sudden everybody is like Israel becomes the victim again, and then the House just passed this huge military aid package for Israel, which that would have passed anyway, but it just seems like now it's like they kind of have the Congress, everybody in the US is like back on their side again. Everybody that matters.
How do you explain? I mean, you're American. I'm still trying to understand your politics sometimes, but it would seem to me U.S. public opinion is at least divided on this issue. At least it's 50-50.
Mhm.
Okay. Although I suspect there's far more skepticism. And yet, when it comes to your representatives, I mean, it's like a church, the
Mhm.
way they stand behind Israel. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, I think like in the long term, because there's definitely a generational divide now, like younger people, it doesn't really matter what their political ideology is. They're way more skeptical of this US relationship with Israel. And that's includes a lot of young Jewish people. I mean, um, there's kind of this narrative that at these college campuses where all these pro-Palestinian groups, it's not safe for Jews, but if you look at these pro-Palestine college groups, there is usually a lot of young Jews in them because they don't want anything to do with the state of Israel. So, but again, that's kind of more in the long term. Right now, it's definitely seems like judging by the polls are tough. To really, not sure if you could trust them. But when you see like consistent results. We've seen basically since October 7th consistently that the majority of Americans just want a ceasefire in Gaza, want the U.S. to push for a
Yeah.
ceasefire. And that's not what they're doing. So with Israel, I think it's just a matter of the influence that the lobby has. That's going to take a long time to really change anything in D.C. And you have a handful of progressive Democrats who are very critical of Israel, but it's just a very small number at this point. I think that's going to grow. I think it's going to grow on both sides. Republicans are way more pro-Israel generally, so maybe not anytime soon. But right now, it's just. Biden is like a perfect example of this kind of the old guard view of Israel.
Oh,
It's all of his incentives right now. With there's a lot of Democratic voters who are not going to vote for him. They're probably just not going to vote in November, and it's probably going to cost him the election. And he's still just going, 100% support for Israel. It doesn't seem like he's considering.
well, I mean, if I had to choose between him and Trump, I mean, obviously from a Palestinian perspective, I think they pretty much beat the both, but I would guess he's a little bit less constrained or restrained than Trump would be, because Trump almost started a war with Iran, right?
Mhm.
But those are the two options on the table. It's not the perfect world.
Yeah.
We get your view on the Palestinian issue. So the word genocide has now been thrown around a lot. The South African government has obviously taken Israel to the ICJ. It's worth noting that Naledi Pandor, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, is a converted Muslim, and she's married to a very strong pro-Palestinian activist. So that definitely played some role in pursuing in the government's decision. I had the impression initially that Ramaphosa did not want to do this. He was very hesitant, but he went along with it anyways. And the reason he wouldn't do it is because he was actually close to the Jewish lobby at home. They actually supported him coming to power. Now he's being accused of taking money from Iran, so the narrative has shifted completely. Anyway, so it is what it is. But if you evaluate the facts on the ground, so what I'm seeing is 30,000 dead Palestinians. Depends who you ask. Israelis claim it's less, Palestinians say it's more. I mean, is this on the level that you would classify genocide yet, or is it something in between? I mean, how do you assess that?
Well, I'm always very careful, to use when it comes to the word genocide because I think it's thrown around too much. But I think if you look at the conduct of what Israel's done in the past 6 months, especially right in the beginning, and the rhetoric, I think it's pretty clear that what they ultimately want is just to kick all the Palestinians out of Gaza, to just take over Gaza. But they're not going anywhere. And so while they're there, I think they're just going to kill and starve as many as they can. To a point, they also have to, even though the U.S. isn't really putting any real pressure on them to stop, they have been at least making sure they let enough aid into Gaza so that they
Yeah,
can claim that they're helping the people. I've seen John Kirby is a White House spokesman. He said in one press conference, he was like, "Name a country who's done more for the Palestinians than the United States." And he's talking about the aid shipments, which is just completely, it's like any country that doesn't give all these
I,
bombs
I,
to Israel.
I can't help but paraphrase one of the apartheid leaders, John Foster, used to say, "Show me a country that's done more for the blacks than South Africa." That was their pitch at this time. It
Yeah,
sounds
yeah.
it sounds similar to that.
Yeah, yeah, it does. And I mean, history, so when it comes to genocide, I think it's fair to call this a genocide, especially just because you see the number of children being killed and civilians, and again the starvation tactics and they're clearly trying to destroy all the infrastructure. I mean, they've attacked I think every hospital in Gaza,
Every
and of course,
school,
like
universities is gone.
yeah, and just blowing them up. Like there's videos of them just like controlled demolitions of universities, and they're destroying graveyards. The CNN actually had a really good report on it. They were one of the few news outlets that, foreign news outlets that was able to get reporters into Gaza. And they had a report how they saw these graveyards were destroyed. And then they looked at the satellite images and they saw Israel was just just destroying all the graveyards. I mean, why are you doing like to me? That's clear evidence of genocidal intent to desecrate their dead like that. Like that shows real hatred for the people. And then if you look at the definition, I forget it exactly, but what is it? Trying to kill a people or people in a place, like it's not, the one argument you always hear is, oh, what about the Arabs living in Israel? They're not genociding them. It's like, yeah, well, they're trying to kill all the ones that are in Gaza in this one place. And
Yeah.
it's a
Well,
million
I
of
mean,
them.
if I look at things, so I look at statistics. So in death numbers, you can, if that's your only statistic, you can say, okay, it's a crime against humanity. Not that it makes it much better.
Mhm,
But if you look at, let's say, Bosnia, the ICJ ruled at the time that only Srebrenica was a genocide. Okay, and Srebrenica was 8,000. So we three times what was a declared genocide by the ICJ already.
mhm,
Okay. Now, a lot of people at the time said, including Edward Herman and Chomsky and them, they were more on the left, said that, look, if we're going to say 8,000 people, as horrific as it might be, is a genocide, then there's genocide everywhere. Then we're stretching the definition. And it's interesting to see that that argument was called genocidal denialism at the time.
mhm.
Okay. It's interesting to see that the exact opposite people of the political spectrum are now making the same arguments. Okay, so that's sort of what I would say. I mean, but whatever it is, it's carnage. The level of destruction that's going on there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can kind of be a distraction, the whole genocide, like this argument about whether or not it's a genocide, because obviously it's a mass slaughter of civilians and it's horrific and it should stop. Um, but at the same time, also like the ICJ case, I think this international pressure at the UN, basically the US is the only country that's, still backing Israel on the world stage. That pressure, I think, is doing something and will.
Well, it's isolating the US in ways that they
Mm,
don't recognize. I mean, it's if I look at the response throughout Africa, which I obviously know quite well, it, you're going to find a very difficult person to convince in most African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, that they are going to cooperate or trust the US again on any of these issues. So they've totally alienated where the youngest population growth in the world will be. And it's not just Africa, it's in South America as well. It's throughout
Mm,
the world. I mean, if you look at the UN vote, the US has completely isolated itself on this issue. And it's so blatantly obvious that the US, I mean, let's assume Iran did anything remotely close to this. I mean, what would the US do to them? But because it's Israel, it gets special protection.
mhm. Well, especially because for the almost 2 years before this started, the US was lecturing Russia and, you just look at all the rhetoric from the US officials, for the past couple years, like, before this, and then they turn around and support that, like, something as horrific as this, which, of course, the war in Ukraine is horrific, but it's not anything like what's happening in Gaza. It
Well,
is like a bigger scale of a war, but it's not just complete destruction of a civilian.
and the war in Ukraine is far more symmetric in its conflict, whatever you think
Mhm,
of both sides. I mean, I find Putin and Zelensky equally despicable, to be honest with you. But it's symmetrical. You've got NATO against Russia. So you've got force against force, and they sort of have constrained each other, although Russia more ways would argue than the US. But be as it may, in Gaza, there's nothing. I mean,
mhm.
you can't seriously tell me Hamas, whatever they did on October 7th, is a threat to Israel. I mean, the Israelis are just flattening civilians, and it doesn't seem that they defeating Hamas either.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like, this is something that really always sticks with me because when this thing first started, you had General, what's his name? General Brown. He's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's the highest ranking U.S. military officer. He was talking about the civilian casualties in Gaza, and he basically said, keep killing civilians like this, you're gonna that's just recruitment for Hamas. I mean, and this is the the highest ranking U.S. military officer saying that, and then yet the U.S. still continues to support this thing, and they don't believe that this goal of eliminating Hamas is realistic. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's just so much, that it's clear that this is just a kill, destruction of a very densely populated civilian area, and they're using Hamas, as the excuse to do it. And there is some fighting on the ground, but it's not like battalion. They always say, "Oh, there's like 5 Hamas battalions in Rafah." It's not like the Israelis march in there and then all the Hamas battalions come out and they have this big gun battle. It's like a few pop out of a tunnel and shoot at them, or hit them with an RPG, or plant a bomb, and then they run out of the way. And like the most of these guys that they're fighting with at once, it's like just a few people, you know. So yeah, it's not anything comparable to like the Russia Ukraine war.
No, it's not. And I mean, what you're also seeing here, which you'll be on this, is the implication of AI and advanced technologies, if you will, on a Gaza civilian population. I mean, I was reading an article the other day where, basically Israel is using the Gaza population for data collection. I mean, this is clearly not only about fighting terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, when it comes to the technology. Those reports, which I'm sure is that you're referencing the AI stuff. The what was
Yeah,
it?
and there was AI stuff, and there was also drone stuff where they would so the one thing I was reading was they would make like noises so people would come out, and
Oh
then
yeah,
that would
yeah.
basically kill them as well, something of that sort. So
I
yeah,
yeah
eyes
I
noises.
yeah I did see that they had drones make like the noise of children crying or something to lure people out. It's just like, I mean, it's so dystopian. And then the AI, I mean, if you look at that report from 972 magazine, which is an Israeli
Mm.
magazine, cites Israeli intelligence sources, they say they have this AI program to pick out all these targets. Um, I mean, did you read that? It's a big, long report, and the details are just like completely insane.
And the other point is that the failure of AI to distinguish between civilian and military targets,
Mm,
which also come in. So we don't know how many of the so-called fighters they are killing or terrorists, however you define terrorism, is actually a terrorist because their own
yeah,
software can't, their own software, by their own admission, fails at this.
yeah. They said that there's a 10% failure rate, and if that's what they're saying, it's probably. I would guess it's even higher than that.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's
what they also admit to in there is, and this is something we've seen Israel do this whole time, and they've done it before, not at this scale, but bombing Hamas guys in their homes with their families. That is something they did before, but usually not the way that they've done it since October 7th. Um, there was one airstrike that they talked about, or attack, where they decided, okay, there's one Hamas commander and 300 civilians might be killed. 300 civilians might be killed to kill one guy, and that's a airstrike that they signed off on. And then, so I mean, what is that? That's not collateral damage. If 300% of the people you're killing are civilians, like,
and then they claim, and this is I must commend them at the level of lying. I mean, the confidence they give it. Then they go in the media and they claim, but we are the most moral army, and we take exceptional steps to make sure that all casualties are avoided. I'm like, okay, 300-to-1 ratio doesn't sound to me like
yeah.
fine, you know?
Yeah, and they also I forget exactly the details. I'm trying to remember that from that report. Um, but again, how they were specifically targeting these guys in their homes, and this could be a low level Hamas guy. This could be someone affiliated with somebody in Hamas that wasn't actually Hamas, and then there's times where they just have no connection at all, and they end up getting picked by this machine, and their entire family gets wiped out. Or in other cases, it is a Hamas guy, but he's not home when they strike his house and they kill his whole family. But there was another program that did stuff to help pick the targets, the home targets, and it's called Where's Daddy, which, think about that for a second. Why is it called Where's Daddy? It's because they're killing people with their families. Like, so that's like mocking the children that they're killing. I mean, it's such like sick stuff. It's really unbelievable. Like,
And the US keeps on funding this, right?
yeah, yeah. And they'll pretend they don't know about it, but if we know about it, they know about it.
And they
You know?
probably know about much more that they're doing. So
Yeah.
I'll ask you this, what is left of Gaza to destroy? I mean, they talk about Rafah, right? Is that
Mhm.
like the only place that is still standing?
I think it's the only city that hasn't been like pulverized. I think the number is something like 70% of all the homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed.
Wow.
And yeah, I think Rafah, I mean, they've been bombing Rafah quite a bit lately, but it's not destroyed to the level of the other cities. I mean, they just left Khan Yunis in the south, and that was just like, it's from the pictures I saw there, just almost totally destroyed. I think Gaza City is still the city that was like this, that left. It was something like 84% of the homes there were destroyed. And then another thing that Israel's doing that I think hasn't gotten much attention is they're creating this buffer zone, they call it, along the border. And it's an area 1 kilometer within Gaza from the Israeli border where they're destroying every single building that's there and agricultural land that's there to create what they're calling a buffer zone. But really what it is just kind of a way to start, I think, slowly take over Gaza's territory. Because according to Israeli media reports, when they're done with this buffer zone, uh, then they would have taken over 16% of Gaza's territory. That's how big this
Wow.
buffer zone is. And so that they're doing that right now. There's something like 90% of the buildings in this zone have already been destroyed.
And
Um,
that's to get to the Mediterranean, or
what's that?
is it to get to the Mediterranean Sea, or where is it?
No,
Like
so
in the
this
North?
is along like Israel's entire border with Gaza.
Right.
It's along the whole thing. They're creating
Oh, so
this.
it's like a strip they're taking basically, so
Yeah,
cutting a strip out of it.
and then they also made this road below Gaza City to cut northern Gaza from the rest. That's kind of similar, and they're saying that they're going to control that indefinitely, so they can go in and out of Gaza as they please. So we are seeing them like take over parts of Gaza. They're building like military outposts in central Gaza too, like basically military bases. Um, so again, I still think the ultimate goal is just, you know, get these. They really want to just take it over. Um,
And the people in the north, are they still there, or have they been evacuated,
There's a
or
few 100,000 people in the north, I believe, and they have it the worst when it comes to the food shortages. The U.S. has actually said, the head of USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, very high level position. She has said that famine is. She thinks famine's already started in northern Gaza. Um, so I think they're trying to starve them out, and they're not letting. This is one of the big demands of Hamas. I mean, it's tough to really know when it comes to the negotiations, like, because there's all these different reports about what each side is saying. But I know one thing Hamas has been asking for is to let the Palestinians who were displaced from northern Gaza return, and that's something Israel is apparently firmly not going to let happen. And I think it's because they just want to, take over North Gaza at first, and then slowly make their way down. But you know, they still have to, I think, have this image that they're fighting a war here, and this isn't just like a reason to take
it
over
seems to
Gaza.
me, I've heard some Israelis tell me that this is about other military objectives, and some even being defending it, saying that we need to prevent these attacks from happening again, and therefore they're doing this type of things. Which,
Mhm.
I mean, you can sort of see somebody rationalize themselves into that. But now, here's my question: is like, what is the threshold before the US says this is enough? Okay, like what I mean, like how far do you still have to go before you realize, okay, maybe we shouldn't give these guys weapons.
Mhm.
Maybe we should put some restraints on them. I mean, is there any sign of that occurring?
When it comes to Gaza, I mean, so there's this military unit that the U.S. is apparently going to sanction, eh, a military unit within the Israeli military over, and this is actually is over um, war crimes that they committed before October 7th, stuff that happened in the West Bank and in Gaza in the past. Um, and this is expected to happen this week, but this is kind of different, kind of a separate thing than what's happening right now in Gaza. And I thought for a second, I thought that after they killed those World Central Kitchen workers, that something was going to change because again, it was so brazen. It was clearly like a targeted killing. The details of that strike are totally crazy. They were traveling in three separate cars along a route that was pre-approved by the IDF, and they were hit with drone strikes until they were all killed, one after another. Three separate strikes. Um, so I thought something was going to change, but apparently not. So yeah, it's really hard to say. I don't know. I mean, the U.S. is saying they don't want them to invade Rafah without a clear plan for the civilians. Um, but again, it doesn't seem like they're putting any real pressure on them. And then Trump, I think, would probably, Trump keeps saying when he talks about this that they got to finish the job, they got to finish up, they got to, then we'll have peace. But he's saying they have to finish what they're doing in Gaza, and he's really tough to predict, Trump. But judging by his previous presidency, one thing that he did when he came into office back in 2017, Obama left him a bunch of wars in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq,
Wow.
Somalia, and he ramped up all the bombing, loosened all the rules of engagement, basically gave the military free reign to bomb as much as they can. And I think his thinking was, oh, we'll just bomb, we're just going to try to end this stuff quickly and just ramp up all the bombings. And it worked against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. That was because they also had the ground troops, the Kurds and the Iranians and the Shias fighting with them. It didn't work in
Mhm.
Afghanistan, obviously, and it didn't work in Somalia. But that was kind of his line of thinking. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's his line of thinking when he comes in is all right, do it, just do it and get it over with, and then we'll deal with the repercussions. All he cares about is getting elected president. But so
Well,
that
I
I
mean, the thing about him when he came, he did two things which was quite, I mean, horrible. One is he strengthened Sisi's grip in Egypt, his favorite dictator, if you remember that.
yeah.
And obviously Egypt is the US and the UK's puppet regime there, and France's for that matter. I remember France selling them weapons some time ago, basically to keep a lid on Gaza from the other side. And also oppressing the civilian population. And the other thing that Trump did, which was quite obvious, is he escalated war with Iran. And I remember I was in Iran after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, like 6 months afterwards. I mean, the population was hysterical because of what occurred. So from the Iranian perspective, I mean, people have been asking themselves, is this not a preparation for war? Yeah, they've had this back and forth for a long time. So, if you ask some people, they're like, well, okay, we've heard this threat of war for a long time. But it would seem to me that at least Israel wants to drag the US into a war with Iran, maybe to distract from what they're doing in Gaza. And if Trump comes to power, I would not be surprised if he supports that endeavor.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's possible. Um, and it depends kind of where things are at. There's a long time between now and when he would come into office. The reason why, like, I brought that up in the context of
Mm,
is the U.S. at some point going to stop this? I think maybe that might be in Netanyahu's calculations. Is like if Trump comes back, he'll let us do whatever we want. Like, because
But
he
you
gave,
see, Netanyahu was also clever. He knew this was an election year. So
yeah,
he's sandwiching Biden between in a difficult position.
yeah,
He knew,
yeah.
he knew exactly what he was doing. Look, he's clever. I mean, there's no doubt
He
about
definitely
that.
is.
Yeah.
And when Trump was president, he let Israel put his son-in-law Jared Kushner in charge of a lot of the Middle East policy, and let it, recognize the Jerusalem as the capital, move the embassy there, recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, declared that the settlements were no longer illegal, which even the Israeli Supreme Court considers them illegal. I mean, it's the settlements in the West Bank. I mean, he was about as pro-Israel as you can get. But now you have Joe Biden, of course, giving him a run for his money. But yeah, so I think when we see this stuff about aid, I think there is a chance that Trump wouldn't even really worry about any of that and just say, "All right, you guys just do whatever you want. Let's get it done." Um,
Well, I will pivot the conversation for the last few minutes or something else, which is back to South Africa, which is, obviously South Africa took Israel to the ICJ, and we have elections coming up as well. It's in 40 days, maybe less than that now. Um, the ANC was already losing power before this election. As far as we can tell, they're going to get less than 50% of the vote. There are signs of outside intervention. It's not as blatant as it would be in other countries. But for example, the shadow minister of the Democratic Alliance, the opposition party, the shadow minister of international affairs, was invited to the Munich Security Council.
mm,
The US had its first ever military mission to Lesotho, which is inside South Africa, and Lesotho is where South Africa's water comes from a strategic point of view. So they're hinting at threatening water security. So you can imagine the local population are drawing some of these lines, and they're saying, "What are you guys doing? You're trying to undermine our government." I mean, I don't know if this has been picked up in the US media at all. I haven't seen many signs of it, but I've just
mm.
seen some hints at this.
I haven't. No, I haven't really seen anything about that. But yeah, I mean, uh, I would like to look more into it because it doesn't. It's not surprising that the U.S. is going to try to sway those elections after the ICJ thing. I actually expected. I think maybe one of the last times we talked, I said I expected to see kind of more like public pressure on South Africa from the U.S. government, but we haven't really seen that.
There has been, so your Congress, the Republicans organized the Foreign Affairs Committee on South African-US relations. And in that
Oh yeah, that's right.
event, they hinted at AGOA, which is the US-South African free trade relationship. Now, 30% of our trade comes from the US. 30% is from China, but if you add the US plus all its strategic allies, I mean, they dwarf China even. So we are totally geopolitically dependent on the US, whether we want to admit it or not. So they hinted at that. I mean, that they said. Then it seems to me, at least the Democrats surprisingly blocked the Republicans from going ahead with this because it really harm on local South African economy. Then also Naledi Pandor was invited to this Carnegie event for peace at the so it was like a dialogue on US South African disagreements over Israel. And at that event, they asked her about BRICS. Now, BRICS is a joke because it's basically China. It's not this massive economic trade bloc, and there's massive disputes between them. But anyways, and South Africa's tiny, whether we're part of a club or not, wouldn't matter. But then they asked them, what about incorporating full authoritarian regimes? And they mentioned UAE, Egypt, forgot the other one, and anyway, Iran. And then they said, why do you think Iran is a totalitarian regime? Basically at South Africa. And then she would respond and she said, I don't know, frankly, what regime they are, but women this. And before she could answer a question, she was cut off. And then all over the media, it said, South African government doesn't consider Iran to be totalitarian. In addition, in our media, there's now stories saying the South African government accepted bribe money from Iran to win the next election. That's the narrative they're going with.
Mm.
So there is signs of intervention. I'm convinced of it. It's not as blasé as Maidan, for example, or one of these events. But
Yeah.
it's clear an attempt to spin the events or to spread stories in the local press. There's also allegations that Russia is funding the ANC and the breakaway parties, which is complete nonsense, things like
Mm.
that.
Yeah, I think I have seen some allegations about Iran, having something to do with the ICJ case, but yeah, I haven't seen too
Yeah,
much.
so the story goes, so there's a South African telecoms communication company called MTN
Mm.
who does business in Iran, but they were accused of bribing their way into Iran in 2019. Now everything in South Africa is corrupt. I mean, you just can't do business without being corrupt. It's just the way it is, unfortunately. Not that the US is much different. Anyway, so there was allegations like this, and it happens to be that our current president was a board member of Iran, of
Mhm.
MTN. Okay, so there was some link between him and you can argue the government or doing business there. But it will also help if you paint in the picture to say, to get elected, Ramaphosa approached the Israeli lobby in South Africa.
Yeah.
So if Iran was financing him, then surely Israel was financing our elections as well. But that would never gets mentioned.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're seeing those type of things being spread. I mean, it's
Mhm.
just something to highlight. I don't know, what to make of it, or if it will play a significant role, but it is there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is always something when signs of potential US intervention, I think is media coverage, stuff like that, like kind of hysteria, because I really do think like if we knew the full extent that the US intelligence agencies and even the US military, like the Pentagon has all sorts of psyop stuff now, like when it comes to social media and media coverage. Like there was a story recently from Reuters that said the CIA started this propaganda campaign against China in 2019 under Trump. And it said it was social media, but it also said that it involved leaking stories to foreign media outlets. And if 2019, if you look back, there's all these allegations about like Chinese organ harvesting and all this kind of outlandish claims that were never proven about China, and like it makes you wonder, did that come from the U.S. intelligence? It's definitely part of the game. I think like if we, I think we don't. I think it's much bigger than people would imagine. Like how much the U.S. government through the intel agencies is trying to influence or does influence global news coverage and social media and things like that.
I mean, I give an example. This allegation that Russia is playing a role in South Africa's elections. I mean, have you seen the distance between the two countries? It's just
Yeah,
absurd on
yeah,
that basis, right? But it was spread by a man by the name of Andre Pinar, who sits on the Atlantic Council.
yeah.
That's the
Okay,
best
yeah.
I could track it. So I mean, it's so sometimes it's easy to figure out where it comes from, and sometimes it's a bit more difficult. And then sometimes there is also plausibility to some of this stuff because the South African government historically has not been like 100% pro-US. They have voted against the US at the UN on various things, and sometimes it's for their own interest as well.
Mm,
So you can easily spin that as saying, okay, because they disagree diplomatically, or because they had other interests, they are now pro-China or pro-Russia,
yeah.
things of that nature. So that's basically that's how I would see these things. But yeah, definitely there's stories being spread of this. Um, on the just go get a last question and on the Israeli one. Is there anything you think that people can do to try and help stop this war?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Americans, I think the thing to do right now, because there is, real pressure on Democrats because it's not just like super progressives or leftists who are against this. I mean, there's a lot of like moderate, regular Democratic
Mm,
voters who are horrified by the atrocities in Gaza. So I think for Americans, if you have a Democratic representative in Congress, even though it might feel like a futile effort, I still just think calling them, writing them, I've been doing that with mine, just to make them know that you are very displeased. If if they have been quiet, silent on it, and aren't calling for a ceasefire or calling for an end to U.S. military aid to Israel, that they should be, because you see there's just report after report of Democratic strategists and Biden's campaign team just worried that this is going to cost them. And there's been all these protest votes in the Democratic primary. So I think in that case, I think it would be good to just pile on with the pressure. It's really the only thing we could do besides, going out to protests and stuff and even like disrupting Biden's campaign events. I mean, it's been a total embarrassment for him. Like every event he does, it gets disrupted by people calling him Genocide Joe. So like that has an effect. I mean, it's like everything he does. He did this big thing at Radio City Music Hall in New York City, and it was disrupted by like 3 separate times throughout this long event of people standing up and screaming at him for supporting what he is. So I
What
think
what
all
what
that
what
stuff.
is what is the equivalent to Trump or Genocide Joe? I mean, I don't know if there's one that sticks yet, but I
Yeah,
don't
no,
think
I don't
Trump would
know.
care.
I saw at some Trump rally, people were chanting Genocide Joe, and he was like
Or
smiling about
maybe Trump will pick up on it. Yeah. Well,
it.
okay,
Yeah,
so
I know. You
so that
never know. Things could, I don't know.
do you think Trump will win? I'll ask that.
I mean, if there was an election now, yeah, I think he would definitely win. But there is a lot of things could happen between now and November. Um,
Okay.
and actually, the
Well,
polls have kind of been shifting. At first, it was showing like big Trump victory, but now it's been getting a little tighter. But still, there's just a lot of time. I would be surprised. And it doesn't seem like, because at first it seemed like they were going to try to keep him off the ballot in some ways, but the Supreme Court would turn over that stuff and did turn it over in a few states. So, even if Trump's in jail, if one of these cases against him, which I can't even keep track of all of them, none of them really seem like they're major things. But even if he could run for president in jail, and if anything, I think that would make him more popular. It's just,
yeah, and I mean the thing that you're using, so obviously using the law to try and go after him.
yeah, it's very obvious
Whatever.
to
I
people.
mean, as if the other presidents haven't done something similar. I mean, I don't. I just think people are blowing it out of proportion.
Yeah.
Anyways, it's our elections in a month from now, so hopefully I'll tell you if
Okay.
we have a regime change, and then good luck with
Yeah.
yours in November. But yeah. Anyways, thanks for the chat, Dave, and yeah, I suppose to the Gazans out there, good luck. Is all I can say because I don't really know what I would do. I would just escape if I was there.
Yeah, yeah, it's tough to imagine.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, and thanks everyone for listening.